Welcome to episode 5. This episode focuses on developing the research proposal. One thing that still surprises me is how often students view the proposal as an administrative task rather than an intellectual milestone. In reality, it is one of the first moments where you begin defending your own thinking. You're no longer simply reading the work of others. You're beginning to explain why your own research deserves attention. This episode is really about learning how to build that confidence. And before we begin, let's briefly look back. This slide reminds us where we've come from. You listened to the scholarly conversation. Now you must explain how you intend to contribute to it. I quite like that progression because doctoral study is not simply about accumulating knowledge. It is about gradually joining a community of knowledge creators. And the proposal becomes your first serious attempt to explain your place within that community, which naturally brings us to where you are in the journey. This slide captures an interesting moment. You have a question, you have literature, you have some initial methodological ideas. The challenge now is creating a coherent plan. One pattern that still surprises me is how many students possesses all the individual pieces but struggle to connect them together. That is perfectly normal, because coherence is often developed rather than discovered. And that leads us to a very important question. What actually is a research proposal? This slide contains an important message. A proposal is not an administrative requirement. It is a justification for why the study should exist. I wish more students understood this early, because proposals are often approached as documents to complete rather than arguments to construct. The proposal is really your first opportunity to persuade people, and that persuasion revolves around a single question. This slide asks a wonderful question. Why should anyone invest time, money, and attention in this research? I would encourage you to return to this question repeatedly. Why should supervisors care? Why should institutions care? Why should future researchers care? Why should society care? One pattern that still surprises me is how much clarity this single question creates. Because once significance becomes clear, many other decisions become easier. And that takes us to the 4 core elements. This slide introduces 4 essential building blocks: problem, literature, methodology, contribution. Every strong proposal contains these elements. I often describe them as a chain. If one link is weak, the proposal becomes difficult to defend. I've lost count of the number of times students developed an excellent methodology but could not clearly explain the problem. Everything needs to connect, which brings us to the logic test. I really like this slide because it simplifies something that often appears complicated. The problem exists, it matters. Knowledge is insufficient. My approach can help address it. If you can explain your study using these 4 statements, you're often much closer to a coherent proposal than you realize. I remember one student who reduced a 10-page proposal to these 4 statements. Immediately, everything became clearer. And another important area also becomes clearer: methodology. This slide addresses something I've seen many times. Choose methods because they fit the question, not because they are fashionable. I've supervised students who arrived convinced they needed artificial intelligence, advanced statistics, or sophisticated software, simply because everybody else seemed to be using them. That is the wrong starting point. Methods should serve the question. The question should never serve the method. And even when methods are appropriate, another reality still matters enormously: feasibility. This slide introduces something students often underestimate: scope, access, resources, time constraints. All these must be realistic. I've become increasingly convinced that unrealistic ambition creates more doctoral problems than lack of ambition. One thing I wish more students understood is that manageable projects are often stronger projects. Doctoral study is not about solving every problem. It is about solving one important problem well. And another important consideration also begins here: ethics. This slide contains a message I strongly believe in. Ethics is not paperwork. It involves responsibility, transparency, respect. One pattern that still surprises me is how late students sometimes begin thinking about ethics. Ethics is not something you add at the end. It influences decisions from the very beginning. Because ultimately research involves people, organizations, communities, or knowledge systems that deserve responsible treatment. And speaking of responsibility, we also need to talk about the emotional side of proposals. This slide captures something almost everybody experiences. Proposal development often creates doubt, frustration, and fear of criticism. I think this is perfectly normal. You're asking yourself difficult questions for the first time. I remember one student saying, "What if my idea isn't good enough?" My response was simple. Very few proposals begin perfectly formed. Most become stronger through challenge, and challenge often arrives through feedback. I think this may be my favourite slide in the episode. Criticism is information that strengthens the research. I've lost count of the number of times students initially interpreted feedback as rejection. In reality, good feedback is often one of the most valuable gifts doctoral education provides. Feedback is not an attack, it is data. Data that helps improve your thinking. And perhaps that is why the reflection questions matter so much. This slide asks 3 excellent questions. Can I explain my study in 2 minutes? Why does it matter? What are the risks? I would encourage you to revisit these repeatedly, because strong proposals are often built through repeated simplification. And speaking of moving forward, let's briefly look ahead. This slide introduces episode 6, Surviving the Lost Middle. One pattern that still surprises me is how many students assume that once the proposal is approved, the difficult part is over. In reality, a very different challenge begins. Episode 6 explores that hidden stage of doctoral study. But before we finish, let's briefly acknowledge the references. This slide introduces some excellent texts. These authors explain the visible mechanics of proposal development extremely well. I would encourage you to use them as thinking partners rather than instruction manuals. And we have one final reference slide before we conclude. This slide continues those recommendations. One thing I particularly like about these authors is that they encourage structured thinking rather than template completion, because doctoral study is rarely about filling boxes. It's about developing judgment. And that brings us to our final slide. Thank you for joining me for episode 5. If there's one idea I would like you to remember, it is this. A research proposal is not a document that proves you have all the answers. It's a document that demonstrates you've begun asking the right questions. And that may be one of the most important transitions in the entire doctoral journey. I look forward to seeing you in episode 6.